There's nothing you're going to say to me that's going to upset me because I'm already really upset. My wife and I and our 2 teenage children, Ruby was 17 and Hart was 14. We were driving out to Joshua Tree, and a drunk and high driver going 90 miles an hour T-boned the car, and Ruby and Hart were killed in the back seat. And I was plunged into this horror, right? The nightmare, the worst thing that I could possibly imagine. In fact, it was so horrible that I never even imagined it. I struggle with guilt. It's just a reality. I was behind the wheel, and it's very hard for me. And so I think about it literally every day.
All right, welcome back to the Better Human Podcast. Today is going to be a very intense episode. We are sitting here with my main man, Colin Campbell. Colin, welcome to the show, brother.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Well, I mean, I think thank you for coming and the story that you have to share and some of the perspective I think is going to be profound for the audience. We're going to get into like grief and mourning today, right? And we're going to hear a little bit about your story. And just for the audience, I mean, Colin Campbell, professionally, you're a writer and director for theater and film. You do a lot of work in Hollywood. You've been nominated for Academy Awards. Like, you've been really sort of successful on that side. You've got your own show, which is titled Grief, a one-man shit show, which I love. You'll talk a little more about that as well. And you've also written a book called Finding the Words, which is really a powerful account of your journey through the worst type of grief that you could ever go through, which is losing children. And your 2 teenage children. So I want to jump right into this with you, Colin. The book has obviously come from your experience and is really sort of focused on the power of grief and mourning and how to do it. And as we were just wrapping before the show, which is something we don't normally do, right? It becomes an isolated sort of thing that we go through. We end up going through it by ourselves, and even worse sometimes in silence. So why don't we kick off with your story? I think that's when I was reading your bio, that's the thing that really sort of captured me.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So so the story takes place in 2019. And my wife and I and our 2 teenage children, Ruby was 17 and Hart was 14. We were driving out to Joshua Tree, and it's a sweet little town about 2.5 hours east of Los Angeles, up in the high desert. Extraordinarily beautiful place. And we were going there for just a brief vacation, and the 4 of us were riding a wave. This is the beginning of the summer vacation, and we were all 4 of us extremely excited about our summer to come. And a drunk and high driver going 90 miles an hour T-boned the car, and she never even touched the brakes because she was too drunk and high to even touch the brakes. So it was full speed, and Ruby and Hart were killed in the back seat. And Gail and I, we survived. We were injured, but it was very disorienting because our injuries were so comparatively light. Some broken ribs, some cracked ribs, and lots of bruising. But we essentially walked away, and it was extraordinarily difficult for us to even accept that it had happened, that it was real, right? There's such a powerful denial that kicks in. But sadly, it was real. It is real. And I was plunged into this horror, right? The nightmare, the worst thing that I could possibly imagine. In fact, it was so horrible that I never even imagined it in the past before it happened, right? So it never occurred to me I could lose both my children. That was not something I thought about. And so I was at a loss, honestly. I didn't know how to survive. I didn't know how to grieve. I say I come from a very grief-averse family tradition. So we did not talk about grief very much in my family growing up. Super waspy, not
right,
to generalize.
Right. Yeah, but that's to your truth, which is, the grief and this type of thing. I mean, how do you process through that? I mean, it's as I said earlier, the majority of us will just sort of go inward and go quiet and go silent. And in a lot of cases, that's the worst thing to do. And if you come from that family, which is, we don't talk about this kind of stuff. This kind of stuff is like, just you kind of deal with it by yourself. I could just imagine what a mindfuck that was when having to go through it.
Yeah, yeah. And so, so my wife is Jewish, and we actually raised Ruby and Hart as Jews. They were bar and bat mitzvahed. We're active members of our temple. Our temple community was meaningful to us, all of us as a family. And so I just leaned on my wife's Jewish traditions. I basically did whatever the rabbi told me to do, And I learned through those process, I learned how to grieve. They literally taught me what grieving is. And one of the first realizations I had is, to your point, I thought that grief and grieving was something you do by yourself. You go off in a corner, and you just be really super sad, I guess is what I thought. And then you get better somehow, and then you come back and join your community. And I learned actually that's not what grieving is about. We grieve in community. Because not only did I lose Ruby and Hart and Gail lost Ruby and Hart, but our community lost Ruby and Hart. All their friends are grieving. All our friends are grieving. All their friends' parents are grieving. Our family's grieving. It's like an earthquake, and the ripple effect extends out. And so part of the Jewish tradition is allowing that community to grieve with you, open up to the community. So, for example, they do this thing called Shiva, sitting Shiva, which is the first 7 nights after the funeral. Your community comes every night and literally sits with you in your grief. And in those moments, at first when I was told that, I was like, no, I'm not hosting people right now, right? My children were just killed. But actually that's not what it is. It's not about hosting. It's about having community surrounding you in your moment of pain. And I also discovered just how horribly lonely and scary early grief is. I never really understood that it's so terrifying. It's scary still. It's been 4.5 years now. It's still scary for me to think about living without Ruby and Hart. It's scary. And certainly right after the crash, it was terrifying. And so having community close was really helpful.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you, so that, if we could go back to the accident, I mean, so the car comes T-boning into you 90 miles an hour. Did she have any injuries? Was she critically injured?
She survived. I want to say that I don't call it an accident. I refer to it as a crash, just because it wasn't accidental that she got drunk and high and got behind the wheel. Those were decisions that she made, right? It wasn't accidental. But yeah, so she was injured in the crash. I don't know the extent of her injuries, but she wound up in the same hospital that Ruby and Hart and Gail and I were in. And then she was arrested on the spot, but then released to the hospital, and then rearrested actually a full year later, because it took them a year the police wanted to build their case, very thoroughly. And they did a very thorough job. And she was just sentenced 2 months ago to 14 years and 8 months.
Jesus.
Yeah.
What's your, this is going to be a hard question. Like, were you able to forgive her? Were you able to, and is that even possible?
It's a great question. And I don't have a great answer for it, other than, I have not, thought too much about forgiveness for her. First of all, I didn't have any contact with her until the sentencing, which happened 2 months ago. So for the first 4 years after the crash, there's really no reason for me to think about forgiveness, because she had done nothing to earn forgiveness, right? So it would have been very theoretical. It would have been, to my mind, not genuine to just sort of forgive somebody unrelated to what they were doing, how they felt about it. The night of the crash, she was very unrepentant. I mean, she was drunk and high and cursing and did not ask about us or our children. So I wasn't really in a mood to forgive. And I think it's a great question, because I do think about it in the sense of, do I need to forgive her, and what does it do for me in my grief journey? And so initially I thought I thought I had to. So we talked to a therapist. It was actually Ruby's therapist. Gail and I both went to Ruby's therapist. Part of why I asked the question,
which is, you traditionally hear there's a process, and part of that is you forgive. Right. And I'm like, fuck, man, how do you how do you even remotely go there for a second? And does that actually help with the grief process? So yes,
Right.
you were speaking with Ruby's therapist.
We were talking to Ruby's old therapist, which was kind of amazing, because he loved Ruby, and then he offered us, said, "Come, I think I can help." He specialized in OCD because that's what Ruby suffered from, and so obsessive compulsive disorder. And so, and some of the thoughts in early grief are very much like that. You ruminate, you get stuck in this loop about the crash. What could I have done differently, and how can I fix it? So they had some OCD qualities. So it was very helpful to talk to him about it. And we talked to him about forgiveness, and he said, "You don't need to forgive her. Why do you need to do that? Who said you had to?" Right? And it's like, oh, right. We just sort of assume that's what you're supposed to do. But it's really just part of our own process and where we're at. Gail and I both spoke. We went to a men's prison a few months ago and spoke to a group of men who were in prison for DUI, and DUI deaths, murders, and they had really dedicated their time to raising drunk driving awareness. They made a group, a club in this prison, and they were trying to change the laws to save people's lives and to actively stop drunk driving. And that, I respect that, right? I did not feel anything but love towards these men they'd done something terrible and they were trying to make amends. So I think forgiveness is certainly possible.
Yeah. You mentioned your wife being Jewish. I'm Jewish. So I know Shiva and the community and the rabbi and yeah, it's not hosting. It's actually, in a lot of cases, you're hosted, right? You're looked after, right. but you sit with a community. You sit with people around you. How powerful or how much did that help? Like, I mean, considering the fact that, with your background, that wouldn't have happened, right? You wouldn't have had a Shiva with people from Christianity or being Catholic. So, I mean, was that helpful? I guess is my question.
Yeah. Well, absolutely.
Helpful might be the wrong word, but was that
No, I think it's
supportive?
The right word. Yeah. Because, like I said, I didn't want people to come over. I thought I wanted to be alone because I thought I couldn't handle it. But then when people gathered and our rabbi said some prayers, and then she turned to Gail and I, our rabbi's name is Sharon Brous. She's a wonderful, brilliant rabbi. And she said, "Would you like to say any words to these people who are gathered?" And I discovered that I did. I really wanted to talk about Ruby and Hart and about my grief because I was trying to process it. I was trying to understand it. And I think part of what I learned about grief and grieving is that we need to process it just like we process anything else. And we do that very often by talking about it to other people, right? So we go see a movie and it's really funny and we're like, "Oh, that's a really funny movie." But then we go home and somebody says, how was that movie? And we tell them why it was funny. And in that process, we sort of understand in a deeper level, oh, that's why I thought it was so funny. It's not until somebody asks you that you have to really think about it and put it into words, articulate it, that you really come to a deeper understanding of your experience. And we do that for every experience except for grief, right? Very often we don't talk about grief. That's the one thing we don't talk about. And as a result, I think it's very stifling and stunting to not talk about grief.
Well, what you're also describing is what is known as the talking cure, which is basic therapy, right? Which is the capacity to go and speak. And where that comes from is it's a concept called debriefing, which is someone has gone through a traumatic event. This was discovered in the military, right? So it was utilized within the military, which is people go through traumatic events. Today, we understand the word or the definition or the whole concept of PTSD, right? Post-traumatic stress disorder.
Right.
Which says, we went through a severe event and there's been a residual impact in a negative way, right? And the disorder piece is it's disrupted my normality, working, functioning, spousing, moving along. And there's only one way to actually go through that, which is by definition going through it and talking through it, because the more you talk through it, the more you can process it, not from the intensity, because when you're going through, when the event has happened, that's the last memory, right? And as you just described, the more we talk about it, the more we understand, and the more we're able to wrap our head from a not even a logical standpoint, but just from a more information standpoint. So, what is the process for grieving? I mean, or better question, why do you think that we grieve and go through this process by ourselves? What is it about grief that all this other stuff, PTSD and all the other elements and challenges that we go through, it's almost normal in quotations to talk about this stuff, but these types of events, right? Why do we have such a hard time talking about it?
Yeah.
Have you thought about that?
Yeah, yes, I thought about it a lot. I wrote a whole book about it. I think it's on both sides. So the griever, when we talk about our loss, we feel a lot of pain. It hurts. It hurts for me to look at a picture of Ruby and Hart. And it's also scary for me to look at a picture of Ruby and Hart. But if I don't look at the picture of Ruby and Hart, if I allow that fear of the pain to get me to compartmentalize or avoid, then I'm cutting myself off from their love and my love for them. If I'm not allowing myself to think about Ruby and Hart, then what a tragedy that is, right? What a deprivation that is for me. And so what I discovered by leaning into the pain of grief is that, in fact, it hurts less and less, and I get more and more access to the joy. So the more I'm able to engage with my grief, actually the more present I become in this world, in this life, as opposed to being trapped or locked in the past. I think a lot of people think, oh, they're grieving too much. They're holding too many ceremonies. They've got they've got an altar at their home. They got all these pictures up. They're stewing in their grief, but actually that's the opposite. We're moving through our grief. We're allowing ourselves to grieve so that we can be present in this life. And I think by compartmentalizing, by listening to that fear, that's when we stay stuck in the past, ironically, by trying to avoid it. Yeah. And then the flip side, I think the people that are surrounding people in grief, they get this message. They get this messaging from two sources. One, in early grief, very, very often grievers do push people away. Just like I wanted to push people away during Shiva. I was like, I don't want people to come to my house. My first instinct is no, right? I'm not up for it. Back away. And so they get that message early on, our friends and community, and they're like, oh, they want to be left alone. I'll leave them alone. And so then it becomes more and more isolating, right? And then we get this message from film and TV as well. So often grievers are shown not wanting to talk about their loss or their loved one. It happens over and over again. You get this really tough character, right? He battles aliens, literally, right? And then all of a sudden he's like, don't talk about my dead daughter. How dare you? And it's like, really? That doesn't seem real to me. I talk about my dead children all the time. It's very important to me. So that seems strange that this really super tough guy can't talk about someone who died, who they love deeply, right? But that's the message we get. And so we think, oh, let's leave them alone. They don't want to talk about their grief. It's too painful.
Right. It's profound in what you just said, which is, males traditionally have learned how to manage their emotions by internalizing them. Right? Which is, let me bottle it up and keep it on the inside, and we're not going to talk about that stuff, and I'm just going to move on, and I'm going to save the world to save the planet type of stuff, right?
Right.
And we're in a world where, and back to the debriefing and the processing through these events, the more we talk about it, the more we get healthy, right? The more we grow through it. I wanted to ask you about the spousing side of things. Like, what was it like, or better question, how did you handle supporting your wife while also going through the grief, and maybe vice versa? How did she show up in this with you?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we as a couple, very quickly, it became clear that we were being drawn closer together through this because we were going through it together. This was the most catastrophic thing that could ever happen to either of us. And it happened to both of us. And we're the only ones in the world who lost our children, Ruby and Hart, right? So we share this very specific connection and bond. And I think because we talked about it right from the get-go, it allowed us to draw closer. I think oftentimes I've spoken to many couples who've lost children. That's what happens when you lose children. Suddenly you meet other people who lost children, and your community becomes a community of grief. And when I talk to couples who are struggling, very often it's because one partner doesn't want to talk about it. They're trying to compartmentalize it. They're trying to not engage with the grief. And that is so hard when the other person wants to engage in the grief, and they don't have an active partner in that. So I think that's when couples run into trouble.
That was going to be my next sort of thought and question, which is, you hear about these unfortunate stories, and the couple doesn't make it together. This event is a thing that pulls them apart. So the real question is how do you show up for your partner? And I think you just answered it, which is you both have to actively be willing to grieve together. It's not, and without that, it's tough, right?
It becomes very hard because it's the elephant in the room. How can we not talk about this? This is it's all we're thinking about, right? Your children die and you're there making breakfast together. We're both thinking about it. And if one of us is pretending it didn't happen or is trying to not think about it, it's not going to work. And calling it out and addressing it makes it so much less scary.
Right. Can I ask who was driving?
Yeah, I was driving.
Yeah. And was there any blame? Was there any faulting in this? Like your wife saying, like, you know what, you were driving, and was there any of that type of emotion? And was that normal?
I think, I guess luckily for me, my wife did not blame me. She and I struggle with guilt. It's just a reality. I was behind the wheel, and it's very hard for me. And so I think about it literally every day. Every day I think about, because I go behind the wheel every day, right? I'm driving my car. So how am I not thinking about that? So I do. And it's hard. So I've just learned to live with it. I've learned to live with my loss. I've learned to live with my grief, and I've learned to live with my guilt. And I can intellectualize it and, say that anybody would have made that turn because she was going so fast. How could I have known? And it would have been so easy for her just to have slowed down a little bit. She had plenty of time, and she didn't. But there's still that guilt there. There was a terrifying moment because I didn't remember right after the crash. I was knocked unconscious. We were both knocked unconscious, from the impact. And so I had trouble remembering exactly what happened. And in one moment I was worried, what if I had made an illegal left-hand turn? What if it was illegal, what I had done? And I suddenly panicked.
So you were making a left through an intersection, and they were bombing the other way.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. I was pulling into a gas station. And so for a moment I thought, what if I crossed a double yellow line and I made an illegal turn? It's possible. And there was this panic. Both of us honestly panicked because we would have had to struggle with that, right? That would have made me at fault. But then we Google Earthed it and saw there's a turn lane and arrows turning and dotted lines, and you're quote unquote supposed to make the turn there. It was not an illegal left-hand turn. It was a regular turn. So, so that there are, of course, couples who do struggle with that someone is technically, at fault. And the reality, I think, that I'm trying to come to grips with is that we are not in control. That, you think you're in control. You think you play by the rules, and you make all the right turns, and you do all the things properly. You wear your seatbelts. But the truth is, terrible things can happen to good people, and we are not in control. Ultimately, we can't protect ourselves. There's no such thing as safety, actually. So that helps me as well. But it's a difficult concept to actually take in. Scary.
No kidding. No kidding. You know, I often say that like everything happens for a reason and the universe puts you on your path and this is the journey
Right.
you're supposed to take. And I hear your story and I think, fuck, that can't be the universe and the journey and the path. And, you know, what was all of this? You know, what is this sort of, you know, whole world of fate and purpose and, as you said, security and safety and is that all nonsense? Is it all just life is chance and you know we're lucky if we can get through it for as long as we can.
Yeah, I have a real visceral reaction now to, I used to say everything happens for a reason, just like you, you know. I used to think, oh, because that's the idea. Like we get a challenge, something's really difficult, we overcome that challenge and we're better. And so it all happened for a reason. And now I really can't stand that phrase.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't think I'm going to use it after today, by the way.
Well, thank you.
Don't thank me. I'm like, wow, like what a stupid fucking thing to say, right? So what do you say? Like, what is the motto or the thing that you believe now? If things,
I believe choose love. That's what I believe. That's my motto. Choose love. Because losing Ruby and Hart, I was a very invested dad. I was definitely a hands-on, you know, mostly stay-at-home dad. So I did a lot of parenting. It wasn't like I was, you know, an absent father at all. I got to do all the good stuff with my kids. And I appreciated it at the time. I valued being a dad for sure. But once they were killed, it suddenly became clear to me, like, oh, that's all that matters. I would trade everything to get them back. Everything. And so that was like an eye-opener in the sense of like, right, that means love is really all that matters in the end, right? Nothing else would have shaken me the way their deaths have shook me. Nothing at all. So that sort of taught me viscerally the power and importance of love. Yeah.
Right. You're a writer by trade and by profession. So is your wife. How much of writing the book helped you process through this?
A huge amount. I needed to write. So I started writing the shit show that you mentioned earlier, this one-man show. I started writing it about 5 days after the crash. I needed to write just to process this. It was such a insane thing that had happened to me, that was happening to me. And so I needed to write about it. And I wrote this whole show. 6 months later, I'd finished it. It was a full length, one-man show by the end. And then lockdown happened, COVID. And so I couldn't perform it because we were in lockdown. And I started writing the book. And so clearly, and also I was journaling every day as well. So I needed to write. I needed to put out these words. They definitely helped me process it all.
And what about your wife? She's a writer as well. I mean, was journaling also a tool that she used?
Yes, she also journaled the first year, every day. And then she wrote a book as well. But her book is this marvelous, wonderful, hilarious, middle grade book. So for 2nd to 6th graders, it's called The Big Dreams of Small Creatures. The Big Dreams of Small Creatures. And it's so wonderful and fanciful and imaginative and charming. And there are characters in it that are Ruby and Hart. So she went, you know, the other way, I guess. She turned it into a beautiful honoring of Ruby and Hart, a celebration of them. It's about a young girl who discovers she can talk to insects. And then it's about this young boy who wants to be an actor because Hart wanted to be an actor. And he's actually kind of the villain in the story, but then they bond. And there are also 2 ants in the story, 2 insects who are really closely modeled on Ruby and Hart. So there's several characters who are able to embody Ruby and Hart. Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
That's amazing. And have you ever had her on your show? I know it's the one-man, show, but I mean,
No.
you've
No,
never
but
had
she's
her
come
on
to
your
see
show?
it. She's come to see my
cool.
show when I perform.
And is it a live show that like you perform?
Yes, live. Yeah.
So it's not like a podcast that you're doing. It's a theater show that you're doing.
Yes.
Okay. So tell us about the show.
Yeah. It's Well, first of all, I conceived of it as a comedy, as like a stand-up routine. That's what I thought it was going to be. It was going to be the darkest stand-up routine that's ever been written. That's what I sort of thought about. I don't know why I needed to do that, but it helped me. Then it evolved, and now it's really just a piece of theater. It's not a stand-up routine. And there's a lot of humor in it, very dark humor, but it's not exclusively about laughing. And I in the show, I tell the audience, it's very possible that some of you might be laughing while others are crying at the exact same moment. And that was true when I performed it. Almost every show, there'd be people laughing and crying at the same time. It's a very raw presentation of grief. And me, the character, I go through this arc. So I start off a lot of anger, right? A lot of rage at the universe for what happened to me. And then I try and get help from books, from grief groups, and I start to fall into this trap of comparing loss. So I'm comparing my grief to other people and complaining about it, right? This person thinks they got it so bad. They only lost one kid, right? They have other living children. What are they complaining about? So I get very dark and obnoxious.
That is very dark. Yet you could see the humor in it, right?
Yeah. So I kind of make fun of other people with dead kids, which is pretty dark. But then I turn and I start really comparing grief, really comparing loss. And I start to see all the ways that I'm fortunate, that other people's losses are actually in a way worse than mine in very different ways. And then I turn again and I land in a place of grace and openness. And it's like, let's not compare loss. Let's just honor all our loss, right? There's no benefit gained from comparing losses. It doesn't help anybody. And actually, let's just say we're all grieving and honor that. So hopefully it lands in a more uplifting place about let's move forward in our lives and allow ourselves to feel the feelings of grief. Yeah.
And maybe this is advice that we give for friends and community. So community like the Shiva and the shul and the rabbi, it's a different kind of community, but like our friends and our family. And, I've heard this before. One of the worst questions that you can ask someone going through a process like this is, how's it going today? Right? Because it's a stupid question to ask, right? Like, how the fuck do you think it's going today? Right? Like I'm processing.
Actually, I love that question.
Okay. So tell us more about that.
I love that question because the way you phrased it that way, how is it going today? Because that is acknowledging that I'm going through something difficult. It's not saying, "Hey, how you doing?" Which that's
that's the question I was going for. I'm too trained in this stuff. But how are you doing? It's a stupid question, but how are you doing today?
Today, right? Yeah, because that's an offering, right? That's acknowledging that I'm going through something that's very challenging in my grief, and you're willing to listen to it. It's saying you're genuinely asking to have a real conversation about loss and grief, as opposed to how's it going, right? And I can take that or not. I can just say I'm doing fine and move on, or it's an offering. Or I can actually open up and say, you know what, today is really challenging. It's Ruby's and Hart's birthday is coming up in a month and a half, and it's tough right now for me. So I can engage in a very real way. So I love that question. And I love when people ask me about my grief, even now 4.5 years later, because I'm thinking about them every day. I'm having a hard time every day. And I love when people acknowledge that I'm struggling.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Have you changed any friends? Like, has some of your friend group changed because of your experience, which is you realize like, shit, these are just people that I don't want to have in my life, and it's just not the right people. Community is really important. So did that happen at all?
Well, it's interesting. That's really one of the reasons why I wrote the book, is because I went to a lot of grief groups and I heard this very common refrain, which was, you're going to lose most of your friends. You're going to find out who your true friends are because most of your friends are going to abandon you. And it was so harsh and shocking, but I could see it was true for them because so many of these people were so bitter. They were so angry. The grief groups, so they would all start with people talking about their loss, sharing the agony, the aching, the disbelief, the pain. And then it would very quickly shift to, and those fucking friends of mine who aren't calling me anymore. I'm so angry at them all. And I thought, I don't want that to happen to me. And I know my friends love me. I know they love Ruby and Hart. And I also know that if I were in their shoes, I wouldn't know what to do. I wouldn't know what to say. And I would definitely not call them. I'd be too scared. I was not a good friend to people in grief before I lost Ruby and Hart, just to be honest. It was the avoidance of grief, right? And so I have a lot of empathy for my friends when they struggle with what to say to me. And so I developed this thing that I call my grief spiel, which happened very early on in the grief process. And I learned it from Shiva, because people would talk to me during Shiva.
It's a Yiddish word.
Yes, it's a Yiddish word, spiel. And it's related to German, which means play. So it's very playful, a playful lecture, basically, is a spiel, right? And so what happened was during Shiva, people would talk about Ruby and Hart, because that was the structure. That was the structure of Shiva. They were given that structure. Once that structure ended, people stopped talking about Ruby and Hart because they weren't given permission to. And they were scared that it might cause me more pain. So I had to tell them that wasn't the case. So that was my spiel. I would pull people aside one at a time and say, look, here's the deal. I need to talk about Ruby and Hart. I need for you to say their names to me. Literally, say their names to me. People wouldn't do it. And also I told them I'm comfortable talking about death, about crashes. I don't have any triggers because I'm already triggered. That was my spiel. I'm triggered all the way. So there's nothing you're going to say to me that's going to, quote unquote, upset me, because I'm already really fucking upset. And I need to talk about my grief. And I can talk about something else for a little while, but then we got to circle back to Ruby, Hart, and my grief, because I'm in acute pain right now. This is early grief, right? We're talking about. And my spiel would evolve. Over time, it evolved and it changed. It brought in all sorts of other elements. Like, for example, I found that people wouldn't cry around me. They were too scared to. So they'd come over to my house, they'd stay really chipper, upbeat, and then they'd sneak away to the bathroom, and I'd hear them weeping in the bathroom because they were so sad, right? This poor guy and his children. And I'm like, why are you hiding from me? And they said, well, because if they cry, then I might cry, and they don't want me to cry. And so I had to tell them, I cry almost every day. And back then I cried every day. And I'm okay with crying. In fact, I need to cry, and it helps me to see you cry, because then it's telling me I'm not alone in the world, that the rest of the universe is also grieving Ruby and Hart. And that's a comfort to me. And so please don't hide your tears. It's okay. We can cry together. We can laugh together.
Mm-hmm. And we've not circled around, but it's a theme that we keep coming back to, which is the importance of going at life together as a community, as a group. What I also heard you say is that in a weird way, when you've gone through this, there's this weird sort of teaching other people how to grieve with you and how to sort of be around you, where they accept your grieving instead of feeling awkward and uncomfortable and weird. And, and it's true. I mean, one would naturally think, oh, I don't want to, show that I'm upset because I don't want to trigger him. And, I don't want to use the names Ruby and Hart because that might be too specific. But that's the stuff you got to lean into. It's almost like we got to do the opposite from what we naturally want to do. Like, we naturally want to go isolate. Right. We naturally want to go inward, and we got to force ourselves to not isolate, and we got to force ourselves to lean in, and then we got to bring everyone else with us as well. I mean, what a mind F on a responsibility standpoint, which is grieving yourself, but then also guiding people on how to show up for you in that community. Wow.
Yeah. And what was really interesting was I didn't know how it would go over. It's socially awkward to tell your friend something, right? Like, look, here's the deal, friend. But I got such positive reinforcement from it, because my friends were so grateful. Right away, they'd say, thank you for telling me. I had no idea what to say to you. Now you're telling me that's so helpful. I really appreciate it. And so that positive feedback was like a reaffirmation of what I was doing. So I was like, okay, great. So I kept doing it, and I kept getting more positive feedback. So even though it's socially awkward, it's not what you're quote unquote supposed to do, it was helpful. And also I did it with a lot of love too. Because I knew that, I was scared that I would scare people off if I was like hostile, like, you asshole, why didn't you just know what to say to me, right? That's not going to work. So I always try to preface any kind of guidance I give to friends with lots of love, like, thank you, and this is so wonderful, and also, please, could you not do this? Whatever it is. Yeah, and in my book, I actually share the words I use. So I share emails that we've sent. I share conversations. So because I love taking away some of the mystery. Like, this is literally what I said to people. This is literally what I wrote to them, to get this positive reaction. Yeah.
That's good. That's good. Is there stages to grieving? And what are they?
I think the short answer is no. And so the stages, that's really led to unfortunately, to a real misunderstanding about grief. Just the word stages. I think that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross used it, right? When she initially was studying people who were facing end of life. So it was on death and dying. And she noticed that just from her casual observance, they seemed to go through these stages. And then she applied it to grief and grieving, but it doesn't work that way. And she acknowledges that in the book. If you read her book, she doesn't say that we go from anger to depression to whatever it is, bargaining to acceptance. She said that we don't move through those stages. But the word stages kind of implies it, right? You hear stages, you go through stages up, and then you eventually graduate to acceptance. So that's been misunderstood, and I really wish she hadn't used the word stages. Because in fact, we experience those feelings all the time, all mixed up. So I can be angry and in denial and struggling with grief or guilt all at the same time. And I cycle through all sorts of feelings. So yeah,
I was thinking about a circle or a cycle, right? Where it's not exclusively you do this, and then once you pass that stage, it's a continuous cycle and can all be looped together, or it could just be sort of at be more in the sort of anger stage. Again, there's the word.
Yeah, right.
But
So
anger
it
cycle
makes you think that, but
right.
Yeah, and also, I mean, I think the truth is that we experience an awful lot of very confusing feelings, especially in early grief. A lot of them, and they're all mixed up. So I don't think stages helps. I think it actually confuses people, and I've seen it be taken literally. So people say, like, "Oh, I'm in the anger stage now, and I'm going to be," and that's just not
I think
helpful.
people do that because it gives them some sense of control and process, which is, I know now I've completed X and I'm eventually going to get better. It's a falsehood.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But I think, yeah.
And I even just the journey towards quote unquote betterness, it's not linear at all. And I can have good days and I can have bad days, and years have passed. And sometimes I'm just overwhelmed with the pain. And other days I'm very functioning. I'm high functioning. So
yeah. Wow. What are some resources out there for when it comes down to people going through trauma and if we want to sort of get people out there to say, hey, here's some places, some communities, some resources that are helpful for your process?
Yeah. I found grief groups very helpful, especially in the early days. And I know I've spoken to a lot of people who've gone to one grief group and it was like, oh, that didn't work for me. And they don't go back. And in fact, my first experience with a grief group was terrible. Gail and I both left in tears and rage, but we kept going back, and I'm so grateful that we did. So for example, Compassionate, to the same group. So Compassionate Friends is a national organization that is there for bereaved parents, siblings, and grandparents. They're all invited there. And it also divide up the grief stages. So for miscarriages and newborns, they have a separate meeting. So I think that's helpful. And I've been to this other group called Our House, which is very helpful, but it's Los Angeles based. They're a great grief group. The Dougie House or Doogie House. I don't know how you pronounce it, but Dougy.
I guess it depends whether you're in Canada or the
Yes.
US. Right? Be like
Yes.
Dougie.
Dougie
versus
House.
Dougie.
They're wonderful. And so I would encourage people to find community in grief, because there are grief groups out there for you. And just being around other people who are struggling with just similar grief in general, I think is so helpful. It's so helpful in terms of the isolation, the feeling of being alone in the world. Because it's lonely. Grieving is lonely.
Yeah. Yeah. Life is lonely. And you know, it's, as we said earlier, if we're not careful, you slip into that isolated little hole and you think it's normal. And it's the thing that you got to fight against, which is life shouldn't be lonely. And specifically going through more difficult times, I'm just going to sort of say it this way. You could correct me if you want, which is the number one thing you got to do is get with a group, get with a community. You know, don't go at things by yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. And the other thing that I found very helpful was staying engaged in life. So, because there's that feeling of just like, I'm just going to lie in bed. I can't get out of bed. I just can't face the day. I can't. And actually, I experienced it when I did stay in bed. I felt worse. I felt more like I was crushed under the weight of my grief. And if I could be active, if I could do something, really anything, it didn't really matter what it was, but if I was active in my grief, going for a walk with a friend, writing, really doing almost anything. And my book is full of things you could do, full of suggestions of things you can do. Having a ritual was very helpful to me. And so,
what was your ritual?
Oh, dozens of rituals. So
anyone that you want to share?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was taught this again through the Jewish tradition, because at the end of Shloshim means 30 in Hebrew, and so at the end of 30 days after the funeral, you're supposed to mark it with some kind of a ceremony. It's marking the end of Shloshim, but they don't tell you what you're supposed to do. And so that, in a way, gave Gail and I permission. We had to make our own ritual. We had to do something, right, to honor this day. And so we gathered our friends, and made it very meaningful to us and to Ruby and Heart's memories, because we had it take place at a park that was very meaningful for us as a family. It's called the LA Arboretum, and we would go there dozens of times every year their whole lives. All four of us loved it. We have all these wonderful memories. We dedicated 2 trees to them. We gathered our friends, and we held a ceremony. And that, in a way, I got kind of addicted to that. It was like, wow, anytime I'm having a really hard time, I can just call together some people and call it a ritual gathering in honor of Ruby and Heart. So for their birthdays, for my birthday, the day of their death, there's a lot of holidays that are really, really rough, honestly. And so I've found anytime I can just whip up some kind of a gathering, a ritual, something, even a small gathering, it's really helpful to me. So rituals are great. Yeah.
Wow. You know, I said to you at the end of the show, we all ask a question on what we could do to be a better human. I don't think that's the question I want to ask. I think the question I really want to ask you is, what do you think? Yeah, I was going to say, what do you think we could do to sort of be better supporters in communities and stuff? But I mean, I think you've really answered a lot of this, and you've shared a lot. And again, I don't think this question's appropriate for this conversation, but I could answer. Yeah, you want to do the better human question? Okay, well,
sure.
Hold on, because let's come back to that. But I got to tell you, man, I like your story. Is I'm very taken back by today's show. I really am. I think there's nothing worse you could do to a parent. I've got young kids, man, and there's just nothing more severe and worse than you think about losing your children, right? In this case, Ruby and Heart, who were well into their life, 17 and 19, and family trip, 14. Sorry,
yeah,
but crazy. Have you gone back to Joshua Tree, by the way?
Yes, that was part of the leaning into the pain. So the full story is that we had just bought a vacation home in Joshua Tree, the four of us. We had been going there their whole lives, like I said, and we had just on a spur, we'd been like, hey, could we get our own place out here? We keep coming out here, and we found this place and we could afford it. It's a small place. It's this old beat up place, but it has beautiful views. It's out there. So it was magical. And we were going out there to check it out. We just bought it. It was still in escrow. And so after the crash, my first instinct was, okay, let's cancel that sale, right? We're not going back to that house, right? But then 3 days later, I called the realtor back up and I said, wait a minute, this is the last thing we did as a family. We chose this house together as a family, and this could be our grief retreat for Gail and I. We can go up there and we can think about Ruby and Hart and be out in the desert, a place that they found beautiful. We can walk up those rocks that they loved. And so we went ahead and bought it. And you have to drive by the crash site to get there. There's no other way. So every time we go up there, we have to drive by the crash site. And the first time we went up there, it was really, really hard. That's an understatement, right? It was terrible. My sister-in-law and brother-in-law flew out to do it with us, and they drove. We couldn't drive. So Gail and I just sat in the back seat, trembling, literally trembling. And my brother-in-law, his hands were like sore for days after because he was so panicked.
He was
gripping the
holding
wheel.
the steering wheel so tight.
Yeah, because it was like, here we go. We're going to drive by the site of this horror that's destroyed our lives, all of our lives. And so, we knew instinctually, if we kept going up there, if we kept going and kept going, it would gradually get less and less awful and more a place of retreat, where we could feel Ruby and Hart's presence. And that's been true. So we've gone up there, dozens of times, maybe hundreds of times since then. Yeah.
Cool. I'm glad to hear that. Magical place, man, for you to go to, and as you said, to grieve, but that was the last place that you were all going to as a family, and it's most people would have given that up. Most people would have withdrew from that, right? So it just goes again to show your story, which is the power of, you got to lean into this stuff. You gotta keep going through the process and chase it, not run away from it.
Yeah, that's my answer. That's my answer for your better human question.
Better human question. All right. Well, let me ask you. Right. So, what do you think we could do to all be better humans in life? Not even tomorrow, just in general.
Yeah. It is to lean into the discomfort. I think that so much of our ills in this world come from people who are avoiding the pain. I think that's why people struggle with addiction. They're trying to block things out, right? We're trying to avoid the discomfort. That's why we let other people down, because it's too uncomfortable to talk to them about real stuff. So we don't talk about the real stuff. And I think if we all were a little more comfortable with being uncomfortable, that would make us all better humans. And that goes for race relations, like everything. These are difficult conversations. Any meaningful conversation is going to be a difficult conversation.
I totally agree. And I like that you said it was a meaningful conversation, not a difficult conversation. Meaningful conversations are difficult sometimes, but it is about leaning into the conversation.
Yeah.
Colin, I am very taken back from today's episode. I think you are a incredible person, and your story is tragic and unfortunate, but like I'm so glad that you're willing to talk about it, and you wrote your book, and you're getting out there and you're sharing, because part of this is a little bit of your responsibility to help people, right? I think we all have that responsibility in life, which is to be better humans for other people, to show up in a community, to sometimes lead the path, and it must be very difficult. But I really appreciate your story, and more than that, your willingness and transparency and openness to talk about this stuff. It's incredible.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
My man, for the audience, by the way, if they want to pick up your book, if they want to come check out your show, let's drop some of your links.
Here's my book.
Where can Amazing. By the way, I'm going to ask you for a signed copy afterwards. I'm going to pick one up, but I would love to get a signed copy from you as well.
I would love to do that. Yeah.
I'll get your address and we'll exchange afterwards. But if they did want to come in and pick up your book, if they wanted to check out your show, where could they find more information on you?
Yeah. So the book's available in any bookstore. So you can go online to your favorite bookstore or go in person to your favorite bookstore. And I'm at colincampbellauthor.com. That's my website, my book.
And one L, like C-O-L-I-N.
That's right. Thank you.
CampbellAuthor.com.
Yes. Thank you for that. And on Instagram, I'm Colin Campbell Writer. And I wished I had done them both the same. And I don't know, grief brain. So it's author.com and it's writer on Instagram. Oh, well.
Yeah, that's cool. I actually just connected with you on Insta as well. So
nice.
stay in touch. All right.
Great.
All right. Any final words for the audience? Well, we just want to sign off.
I was going to sign off. This has really been a really nice, meaningful conversation. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. Thank you. To the audience, I'm not going to do the traditional like, subscribe. I think really go if you want to check out Colin, CampbellAuthor.com, and Colin is with one L. Go and connect with Colin on Instagram, and maybe even put it out there. If you are going through a tough time from a grieving standpoint, pick up his book. And I'm sure, Colin, if they reached out to you, you would be more than willing to connect and share and help. And to the audience, just remember, life is going at it with others and communities. And there's a wonderful proverb that says, if you want to go fast, you go. If you want to go fast, you go by yourself. If you want to go far, you go with others. And this is the power of community. And don't try to do things by yourself. Isolation is probably the thing that will kill us all and is the worst thing to do. Colin, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you. I appreciate it.